So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. So I'm Paul Brockie, Associate Dean for Research and Assessment in the Purdue University Libraries. And we're very pleased that you could join us today to recognize our current and former Library Scholars Grant recipients. On behalf of Dean of Libraries Jim Mullins, we welcome you to the 2015 Library Scholars Grant Recognition Program. So the Library Scholars Grant was established in 1985 with a 50th anniversary gift from the class of 1935, and this year the class of 1935 marks their 80th anniversary. So as we acknowledge and hear from our grant recipient today, let's keep the class of 35 in mind and thank them for their generous gift, which allows Purdue researchers to access rare archival materials all over the world in order to further the research. In just a few moments, we'll recognize the 2015 grant recipients and then hear how this opportunity furthered the research of Dr. Silvia Mitchell, Assistant Professor of History at Purdue West Lafayette. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, our other presenter, Dr. Yvonne Pitts, Associate Professor of History here at West Lafayette, is unable to attend today's event. So we hope to hear about her travels and research in the near future. And as one other side note, today's remarks and presentations are being videotaped and will be viewable in libraries' EPUBs in the future. So I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge the group of faculty responsible for reviewing proposals and determining grant recipients. So this year, the selection committee was chaired by Mary Beth Slobodnik, Associate Professor in Biomedical Sciences Information Specialist in the Purdue University Libraries. And other members of the committee included John Fritsch, Associate Professor of Library Science and Reference and Instruction Librarian, Madeline Henry, Professor and Department Head, School of Languages and Cultures in the College of Liberal Arts, Jean-Pierre Erubel, Professor and the Philosophy, Anthropology, Archaeology, Science and Culture, Jewish Studies, and Medieval Studies Liaison in the Purdue Libraries. That's quite a mouthful. And Rebecca Klein-Pesheva, Assistant Professor of History and Jewish Studies, Department of History, College of Liberal Arts, and a past recipient. So in 2015, the Library Scholars Grant Fund was able to award 5 faculty members to assist in the research. So briefly recognize this year's recipients. First is Curtis Chrysler, an Associate Professor of English at Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne, who was awarded $2,158 to travel and examine the African-American artist Jacob Lawrence's full migration series, which is split between the Center for the Study of Modern Art in Washington, D.C., a part of the Phillips Collection, and the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. Jennifer Foray, an associate professor in the Department of History, who was awarded $3,921 to conduct archival research in the Netherlands. And she is working on a book project entitled Imperial Aftershocks, the Intersection of War and Decolonization in the Netherlands, which explores how, after 1945, various Dutch political actors tried to process their own recent experiences of Nazi occupation and at the same time conceptualize a rapidly changing series of events then unfolding in the East Indies. Kenneth Kincaid, Associate Professor of History at Purdue North Central, who was awarded $5,000 to travel to the Ministerial and Judicial Archives in Quito, Ecuador, to conduct research on indigenous uprisings in northern Ecuador and its aftermath in support of a chapter called 1959 and the Perils of Progress for his book Imbacucha, A Social and Ecological History of Lake San Pablo. We have Dawn Marsh, Associate Professor of History, who was awarded $2,921 to support travel to the Navajo Nation and Oaxaca, Mexico, to conduct research on a book-length project. The research begins and ends with the Navajo blanket, one of the most iconic and familiar images of Native American material culture, and the research will then focus on the ebb and flow of knowledge transmitted through the mechanism of Spanish colonization that transformed textile production in the Americas. And finally, Jennifer Zaspel, Assistant Professor of Entomology, who was awarded $5,000 to travel to the British Museum of Natural History to examine museum specimens in the original literature related to the vampire moth genus Calyptra. So please join me in congratulating all of our 2015 grant recipients. So now I'd like to introduce today's presenter and one of our 2014 grant recipients, Dr. Silvia Mitchell, Associate Professor of History, Purdue West Lafayette, who will share her research and travels. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Silvia Mitchell.
Thank you very much. I thank you for your introduction, and I would like to thank the Library Scholars Grant for a program for supporting my research. Larry Mikitjuk, who helped me through the process since the moment I was interviewing for this position. So I was well prepared for the application, and I appreciate all the assistance. My research project examines the political trajectory of Queen Mariana of Austria, whose life intertwined with major political and diplomatic events in 17th century Europe. As the oldest daughter of Emperor Ferdinand III and Empress Maria of Austria, and as queen consort to Philip IV of Spain, she played a central role in the politics of dynasty and state since birth. As the sole ruler of the Spanish Empire during the minority of her son, Carlos II of Spain, her influence throughout Europe and the world was substantial. The book monograph that I am writing presents the first biographical sketch of one of the most important female rulers of 17th century Europe, and the first in-depth study of her regency in more than 100 years. My study investigates the nature of female rule in the Spanish monarchy and among the Habsburg dynasty within the milieu of court culture, but nevertheless pays equal attention to policy matters during her rule as regent. My presentation today will be devoted to analyzing the significance of Mariana's foreign policy, the portion of my research that I conducted in the summer of 2014 with the generous funding from the Library Scholars Grant. I would like to take a moment, however, to set up the situation Mariana encountered when she assumed the rule of Spain, Spain's global empire, which is critical to evaluate her policies and strategies, and I hope to provide a clear context for you to appreciate my findings. When Mariana's husband, King Philip IV, died on September 17, 1665, the continent entered a state of emergency, to borrow the words of the Venetian ambassador as he described the situation. Spain was the largest empire in the West, with possessions across the Atlantic, the Pacific, and Indian Oceans. The stakes over the succession of the Spanish crown were extremely high. The high mortality rate among children in the early modern period and the intricacies of the Spanish succession created a very difficult juncture. The European system of states, as much as it was advanced by then, by the 17th century, was still utterly dependent on dynastic succession for its survival. The Spanish Habsburgs did not exclude women from the succession. On the contrary, their very global empire had been built on the inheritance rights of women, as well as their political partnerships with the males of the family. The accession of the 3-year-old Carlos II, therefore, who had no younger male siblings, brought the inheritance rights of women to the forefront of European politics. Philip IV gave indisputable preference to his Austrian Habsburg relatives in the Spanish succession, thus creating a very tense international situation, which ultimately inaugurated a new stage of that rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. According to his testament, if Carlos II died as a child and without descendants, the younger of his daughter, Margarita of Austria, whom you see first in the picture over there, would succeed her younger brother. To reinforce this preference, he named the children of his younger sister, Empress Maria of Austria, next. Emperor Leopold I, who's the second person in that PowerPoint, gained his own rights to the succession, as did Queen Mariana herself. To create an even tighter Habsburg succession, Margarita of Austria was to marry her uncle, Emperor Leopold I, thus adding not only themselves to the succession, but potential viable heirs from the combined Spanish and Austrian branches of the dynasty. This airtight Habsburg inheritance was also reinforced by the exclusion of the 2 Spanish-born queens of France from the succession. Philip IV's older sister, Anne of Austria, was not even mentioned in the testament. She had given up her rights when she married King Louis XIII of France in 1612. Philip IV, however, confirmed the exclusion of his oldest daughter, Queen Maria Theresa of Austria, who had also given up her rights to the Spanish succession upon her own marriage to King Louis XIV of France in 1659. And this, it should be noted, was the longest clause of the testament, which included lengthy explanation on the legality of the exclusion and the rationale behind it, something that had to be done in light of the Habsburgs' strict adherence to women's rights to inheritance and succession. The two women, as you probably already know, were the mother and the wife of King Louis XIV of France. This meant that if Carlos II died before reaching adulthood and without descendants, the Holy Roman Empire will have a strong claim to the Spanish crown, while France will be completely excluded. Besides being of enormous interest everywhere in Europe, with copies of these clauses sent to foreign rulers, circulating in Madrid, commented in diaries, discussed in government councils, the situation was also considered extensively in diplomatic circles. Such situation posed a threat to the balance of power in Europe. It actually foreshadowed what actually happened in 1700 when Carlos II's death at the age of 40 without the successors led to the major pan-European conflict known as the War of the Spanish Succession. In 1665, France was not going to passively accept the entire Habsburg inheritance going to the Austrian branch of the dynasty. The continent, therefore, anticipated the prospect of total war. And this was the heart of Mariana's predicament. When she began her tenure in office, Spain and France were still under the peace agreement signed in the Pyrenees in 1659. But the situation was volatile, as the French king was eager to accomplish the main goal of his foreign policy, to break so-called Habsburg encirclement and to expand French territories by annexing part of the Habsburg inheritance. And that meant the Habsburg encirclement is a term that means that all of France's frontiers were surrounded by the Habsburgs. Mariana, in fact, had been warned by the two Spanish-born queens of France that the French king, intended to attack the Spanish Low Countries if and when Philip IV died. To make matters more difficult for Mariana, she also had to resolve other problems her husband had left behind. During the last 5 years of his reign, Philip IV had concentrated the monarchy's military and financial resources on the so-called reconquest of the Kingdom of Portugal, which had been annexed with its imperial possessions to the Habsburg Spanish Empire in 1580. The Portuguese claimed independence from the Habsburgs in 1640, and the Spaniards, facing other crises, had not been able to resolve the situation until 1660, when Philip IV made what turned out to be the last major attempt to bring in the Portuguese crown under Habsburg rule once more. He spared nothing to do so, and although there were at times signs that he may have succeeded, he did not in the end. Facing a combined Portuguese, French, and English army, the Spaniards had experienced a major loss in June 1665, 3 months before Philip IV died and 3 months before Mariana assumed power. This is the context of Mariana's maneuvers during her regency. She began a systematic implementation of policies immediately when she assumed her tenure in office. Within days of having assumed power, she ordered fortifications to be built in the Spanish frontiers with France, moved the Mediterranean galleys from the Italian to the Spanish shores, told governors in the coastal and frontier cities to be prepared for a potential French attack, and began an aggressive military recruitment for a war against France. In order to cement a military, diplomatic, and dynastic alliance with her brother, Emperor Leopold I, she greatly accelerated the marriage of her daughter, Margarita of Austria, to the emperor, who left for Vienna a few months into her regency. High on her agenda was to solve the Portuguese issue, either with a truce or even, as controversial as that sounded early on in her reign, with a permanent peace. This became the most divisive problem in Mariana's court. Two camps emerged very early on: those who supported peace with Portugal in order to face France, and those who argued that it was against Mariana's prerogatives to give up such an important part of Carlos II's inheritance. And this is exactly the way the debate was put the terms of the debate put in the papers that circulated in Madrid. She could not begin negotiations with Portugal directly because it would have legitimized the Portuguese, who technically remained rebels of the Spanish crown. Mariana's decision to choose England as the intermediary in the peace negotiations marked the beginning of a shift in Anglo-Spanish relations and eventually shaped European politics. The first of a series of treaties with England was signed in December of 1665. It established a 30-year truce between the former enemies and granted England commercial rights similar to those given to the Dutch in 1648. The secret clauses named the English king, Charles II, the mediator and guarantor of the peace negotiations between Spain and Portugal. Mariana continued to build a strong network of alliances, even though the French ambassador in the Spanish court, strongly denied rumors of an imminent French attack on Spanish territories. Based on an obscure local law, Louis XIV, to the consternation of his own diplomat, who apologized in the Spanish court before delivering his message, sent a document to Mariana claiming that since Carlos II was the son of Philip IV's second marriage, and Maria Teresa, his consort, was the oldest surviving child of the king's first marriage, inheritance rights thus devolved on her. Lasting less than a year and not especially devastating, the War of Devolution, the first of the two wars fought between Spain and France during Mariana's regency, was nevertheless an important event for European politics and became a defining moment for Mariana as a ruler. When Louis XIV took action against Spain, Mariana had everything in place for a counterattack. She signed the Treaty of Lisbon on January 13, 1668. It recognized Portugal's independence and the Braganzas as the ruling dynasty. Although Portugal had in effect separated from the Habsburgs in 1640, the official split of the Spanish and Portuguese empires did not take place until 1668. It was a critical event in Europe, marking the definite end of Spain's aspirations to returning to a hegemonic position. It nevertheless facilitated gains at many levels. A few months later, working under the Queen's directives, Mariana's diplomats negotiated a triple alliance between England, the United Provinces, and Sweden, an agreement that forced Louis XIV to abide by the terms of the Pyrenees Treaty. The Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle between Mariana and Louis XIV was signed a few weeks later. Mariana kept Spanish territories in the Low Countries virtually intact. The diplomatic correspondence, which I examined this summer, shows how Mariana, working with a cluster of very talented diplomats, essentially extricated Spain from the conflict with France virtually unscathed. Although I went to the archives knowing the types of documents that I was going to examine, I was nevertheless no less than thrilled by what I was able to uncover. My findings provide irrefutable evidence not only of Mariana's agency, which I had an inkling that was what I was going to find, but the effectiveness of her policies. As I am now in the process of finishing the writing part of the manuscript, which I anticipate finishing by December of this year, thanks to this research, I can make a strong argument that Mariana's quest to keep the inheritance of her son intact resulted in the first major pan-European league against the French monarch, Louis XIV of the 17th century. I spent 6 weeks of intense work at two archives, the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid and the Archivo General de Simancas, close to Valladolid, which hold the State Council deliberations as well as the diplomatic correspondence. They are held as legajos or bundles. And I was able to find a picture online because, of course, I cannot take that picture myself. It would be prohibited. There are dozens of those legajos, and you see the size of the documentation over there. And I wanted to show you because it would be absolutely impossible to do this kind of research without going to the archives. There are dozens of these legajos, and which come in boxes. They bring you the boxes, and you open them up, and then you start looking. And you can order copies, but of course, ordering copies of all of them would be absolutely impossible. You just cannot do that. And I hope that you will ask me questions about how the archives were organized and how they came into being, which I think will be of particular interest in this audience. And it's something that I do not get to talk about that often, but I think it is absolutely critical in the process of preserving knowledge and creating knowledge, which is, I believe, a joint enterprise between scholars, librarians, and archival scientists. The War of Devolution cost Louis XIV many of his previous diplomatic gains, such as the League of the Rhine, negotiated in the 1650s, and tied his hands as well, knowing that he could face repercussions if he violated the terms of the treaties pertaining to Spain. He focused his sight on the Dutch, who in his view had betrayed him because he had provided a lot of support, military and financial support, for the Dutch in their quest for independence from Spain. So he began, as soon as he signed the peace with Spain, he began preparations for an invasion of the United Provinces almost immediately. He also implemented an aggressive policy of isolation, signing neutrality agreements with Sweden and other Northern European princes, in which they agreed to not provide aid to the United Provinces when he finished his invasion. He also tried to get Spain to do so, but Mariana refused. She was also seeking herself a military alliance with the Dutch. These maneuvers culminated for the French king in 1672. Playing on a commercial rivalry between the English and the Dutch, Louis XIV negotiated with King Charles II of England a mount joint attack on the United Provinces. Mariana's standing agreement with the English king acted as a protective shield for Spain. One of Charles II's conditions in joining Louis XIV was complete avoidance of Spanish territories in the Low Countries. And this is one of the important instances that reveal the effectiveness of Mariana's policies during the early part of her reign. But with the research that I conducted this summer, I can also argue that during the second half of her regency, Mariana shifted from a defensive to an offensive policy towards France, and that she was highly successful. The process that started in 1665 culminated during the 1670s. Mariana was the force behind a quadruple alliance that included Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the United Provinces, and the Duke of Lorraine. Signed in August of 1673, it marked a high point in Mariana's regency. The first image in the PowerPoint belongs to a circular letter Mariana sent to numerous rulers, part of a campaign against Louis XIV. It offered a concise but compelling description of the French king's so-called unjust actions against Spain. She denounced him, among other things, of, quote, perturbing the universal peace, committing grave offenses against God, and causing a number of scandals and disorder among Christians. She urged the recipient to join forces with her and announced her intentions to declare war, which she did in December of that year, in no uncertain terms and utilizing very strong language. The pinnacle of Mariana's accomplishments came in 1674, when she successfully brokered the peace that ended the Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1674. And in the PowerPoint, you see the official letter that King Charles II, with the original signature, it was translated from Latin, it was also in English and in Spanish, in which he thanks the Queen profusely for her mediation of the peace agreement between England and the United Provinces, and praises her, the offices of Mariana's ambassador, the Marquis de Fresno. With this intelligent maneuver, Mariana robbed France of his major ally. By 1674, Mariana had managed to transform the Dutch War into a pan-European conflict fought mainly against France. This, it should be noted, was the first of a major international coalition against Louis XIV that continued through the end of the century. By the time that the war ended in early 1679, Mariana was no longer regent. Her son had come of age before. But by then, too, she had commenced a different stage in her political trajectory, which you will have to wait for the book or another presentation. What is important to know now to complete this presentation is that during her decade-long rule, Mariana had been largely responsible for ushering in a different era for Spain in the international stage. In sum, my research offers a new way to understand European international politics in an era often described as the age of Louis XIV. Although no longer the indisputable hegemonic power in Europe, the Spanish monarchy still possessed the largest imperial holdings of any other European power and continued to play a central role in international politics. For this reason alone, Mariana of Austria's political trajectory is important, not only to scholars of early modern Spain and women, but to the history of European international politics. Mariana was ultimately responsible for the reconfiguration of Spain's foreign policy. With the swift resolution of the Portuguese problem, alliances with Protestant powers, strategic use of diplomacy, and an effective propaganda campaign against Louis XIV, who was presented to the international community as a threat to Christendom, Mariana helped redefine the military and diplomatic blocs in Europe. Although Mariana's regency was not devoid of problems, an analysis that fails to include the geopolitical dimensions of her rule is a lost opportunity to evaluate this dynamic period in the history of Spain. And I am very grateful to the Library Scholars Grant for supporting my work. Thank you. I think Larry was first. He wanted to ask a question.
Since you talked about Mariana and vis-a-vis England and the United Provinces before, I can seem to know a lot more about it than I do. But so here is a Catholic queen of Spain talking about the Louis XIV as sort of an enemy of Christianity to these two Protestants.
Yes.
That sounds really ironic to me.
Yes. Somebody wants to say something? Yeah.
Just the questions we won't get on the recording unless there's a mic being passed around. So I don't know.
Oh.
Yeah, maybe
Oh.
repeat the question.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, actually. It's great. So why would a Catholic queen of Spain ally herself with Protestant powers against another Catholic monarch? And so that goes to the core of my argument, right? And so this idea of Spanish religious fanaticism, inability to compromise, it goes out the window. It doesn't stand. And it really goes to show that Spain and a woman like Mariana, who looks, right, she dresses like a nun. I mean, there's much more behind that appearance, right, than meet the eye. And I couldn't talk about that in this presentation. Then it really changes the way we think about these women as statesmen, right? They were able to play hard politics as much as the men. And the Spaniards were able also to play politics for their own convenience, right? To put reason of state before religious considerations. So I think that you hit it right on the nail, because it is one of my biggest arguments, is that this is what we have here. It's totally different than what we might think it should be, right? Yeah, thank you. It's great.
Could you tell us a little bit about the differences and perhaps similarities of the two archives?
Yes, thank you. Okay, I wanted to get that question here because I think this audience is gonna appreciate. Can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Yeah, that's fine. So the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, that's a 19th century creation. It actually didn't exist as an archive. As opposed to the Archivo General de Simancas, that became an archive early on because, as you can see, that's a medieval castle. And when the Habsburgs came to power, they found, soon this is the early 16th century, this castle was not appropriate as a royal residence anymore. They started to build palaces, and then in 1561, the court moved permanently to Madrid. But the castle had been a very important center of power during the rule of the Catholic monarchs and before. And it was, as a typical medieval residence, it was naturally protected. It's sort of like far away from places. It's very high so that you can see if enemies are coming and so on. But it was absolutely inappropriate for a Renaissance royal family, right? So they did not use it. And soon they made it into an archive. So probably this is one of the oldest archives that we have in Europe. I mean, I wouldn't claim that it will be the oldest because I have to think of Rome. Probably that's where the oldest archives are. But it was turned into an archive as early as the 1540. And they started sending documents. As you probably know, the Spanish built their global empire not only, I mean, how can they rule a global empire by military might? I mean, they rule by paper, right? It was a huge bureaucracy. So the ability to actually store paper and have paper available was absolutely critical to their success. This is why most of Spanish kings, when you see their portraits, even in the 17th century, they hold a piece of paper in their hand, which is as important as the sword, right? And so this is why Mariana's image at the desk with a piece of paper has a lot of significance, right? In the 19th century, so most of the state documents are there. There are other state archives in Spain, but Simancas is probably the most important one. And usually you find people from all over Europe because since the Habsburgs had possessions in Italy, Central Europe, Portugal, the Indies, and so on, anybody that has any kind of research to do, they go to Simancas. It is not easy to work there. They only open from 8:30 to 2:30, so it's very frustrating. If someone like me trying to analyze the state documents, you cannot just go to Simancas because the Archivo Histórico Nacional that was created in the 19th century, they took what they believed in the 19th century to be the most important documents from Simancas and they took it there. So what happens to us today, right, that we're past those 19th century analytical frameworks, is that if one wants to do this kind of research, you have to go back and forth. So that's the way it works. And basically, I see what you see here, this is the Archivo Histórico Nacional. The desk is on this side. And they have, by rule, by a law that was signed by the Spanish government, they have to admit everybody. So anybody that wants to do any kind of research, they have to be admitted with a passport or an ID. That is not the case in the Archivo de Simancas, that is only open for researchers. So you have to bring a letter of invitation and so on.
To what extent was Mariana's geopolitical and strategic thinking influenced by figures as great as Machiavelli, or Thomas Hobbes? Did she acknowledge that?
Yeah, if she did, we're never going to know that, right? I mean, that would be not acceptable. I think it was being a Habsburg, being born a Habsburg already. That meant that these women, as much as the men, were born into a geopolitical situation. I mean, even as a child, right? She was promised to the heir of the Spanish throne. Then she had to marry her uncle because there's all these problems with the succession already starting when she's only 14 years old. So she has seen as a child the Ottoman Turks in Vienna, right? So all of these issues, they're kind of like part of their DNA in a way, right? So Machiavelli was not an accepted figure, especially for Spaniards, but I think, a lot of those principles were kind of like circling around. Yeah. Larry.
I wanted to ask, I see the legado there, but there's nothing around like the person's arm.
Yeah, no, I wanted, because I was trying to just make a PowerPoint that would be visible, understandable to everybody. So you want to know how it works.
How
So,
big are they? And how do they work?
oh, well, they usually this big.
So that's about life size.
Yeah.
Oh my.
So they're usually this big. They have, I mean, some of them are a little, smaller, but they're all pretty substantial. They're very substantial. The Spanish, they're very good. I mean, when I compare notes with some of my colleagues, I have to do research in other places. They don't put, and especially the Italians are particularly known for limiting the amount of documents you can see. They don't limit. You can ask for as many legajos as you can see in one day, and they're very efficient. You can only ask for 3 at a time. And so they bring them to you, then they are put on a table, you know, this long table. So it's kind of like a fishbowl. You're like there with everybody, right? Everybody's watching you. They're very strict as to, you know, what you can do, what you cannot do. You have to leave all your stuff in a locker. You can only come in with pencils. I mean, it's a whole ritual about it. But they put your documents and everybody's documents on tables on the side. And then you work with your documents, and then when you're finished, you can give them back and get another, right? And then we all try to figure out, because the hours are so short, how to be effective. So you strategically, you know, go to the computer and make the next request when you have only one box in there, and so on. Yes?
Then you request photocopies?
Yes, you can request photocopies, yes. I did request a lot of photocopies because, of course, as always happened, I'm sure you're all going to sympathize with my predicament. Like the last week that I was there, I found a whole other series of documents that I said, oh, what am I going to do? So I went back to Simancas. I thought I was done. And I went back and I spent 2 days requesting documents. And they sent them to me by mail. I was really scared about that, but it did get here. So I have them in my possession. It's a box. So, yeah.
So they photocopy, and that's it. Are they trying to preserve their scans, or are they doing any microfilming?
The entire country is actually there is a movement. They are trying to, all the archives, I mean, Spain, they have so many, right? They are they're in a process of digitizing, but the amount of, I mean, it's sort of like, I think it's not going to happen for another 100. I mean, I don't know, but it will be almost impossible to do it all. So there are some documents, like for example, there's a section in Simancas that is called Patronato Real, which are all the official, like, marriage capitulations, peace treaties, wills, the king's testaments, and things like that are all online. Unfortunately, they put them with a big watermark that says Archivo General de Simancas, so it's sometimes it's not easy to read. So then there is another system that is called PARES, where you can go and do research online, but still there is nothing that compares to the experience of going to the archive and getting those documents, because you do get a much better idea as to how those documents were stored away, which is already an important part of the process, right, of understanding how these people thought about themselves and so on.
Was everything in pretty good condition? You didn't have materials that had been used so much that they were in poor condition?
Not in this case. This is, as I said, this is a very neglected period in the history of Spain. Usually most of the research is done in the 16th century, right, or the early 17th century. And now there's a whole group. I mean, I think I'm one of the very few people working on this in an English-speaking world. But in Spain itself, there's a whole movement of people working on this period. So it's very exciting. But these particular documents, most of them, they have not been seen for a long time. And also these are probably the best preserved documents too, and the best written documents, because this is the court, right? So we have the secretaries have very good handwriting for the most part. When I get a secretary that has bad handwriting, I get in a very grumpy mood. but for the most part, I can't complain. I mean, this is pretty. In that sense, I guess I'm privileged, because I know of people that work with things that are, and when that happens, they don't let you have it, right? Yeah. Rebecca.
You said that this era is usually seen as the era of Louis XIV, and as contained within that framework.
Mm-hmm.
Other than your work, what other work has been done or scholarship generated that is challenging that perception?
I think, so people working on Louis XIV, on French history themselves, the idea that Louis XIV was this powerful monarch has been challenged in itself. So that has come, some challenges have come from historians working on French history. There is a work that is very important on the history of the Spanish Empire, precisely during this period, during the rule of Carlos II, from 1665 all the way to 1700. But it looks at the Spanish Empire, and I mean, this scholar, Christopher Storrs, he's also a diplomatic historian, but he has written this book on the history of the Spanish Empire, and his main argument is the resilience of the Spanish monarchy. So this idea of decline has also been challenged. There's going to be a conference at the end of this year in Madrid, which I have been invited to participate, where scholars will get together. This is a very important group in Spain. It's an important research group. And we're going to collectively see how can we describe this period in the history of Spain. The decline paradigm does not work. The problem with this is that no one has really looked at international politics and put Spain in the center, which I think it should. And certainly no one has looked at a woman, right? I mean, that she gets dismissed just by the mere fact that she was a female ruler, and because there were so many factional struggles in the court, the assumption has been that there is nothing interesting happen. So what I'm hoping to do with my research is to offer a broader view and put into perspective those factional struggles which existed, right? But also account for all the innovation that was done under her leadership, and which I think it also plays a foundational role for what happens in the monarchy after she leaves her position of regent. So that's what I'm hoping to do. Yes.
This may be a frivolous question, given the subject of our discourse here this afternoon, but do you have any insights into her as a person when she wasn't wearing the crown, either literally or figuratively?
Right.
What was her life like? What was she interested in?
Well,
Politics.
yeah, so yes, I mean, I have some idea, although perhaps not as in-depth as we would expect, to write a full biography. But she loved the theater. She grew up in the Viennese court in a culture they had a lot of entertainment. And she loved it. She was a fashionista as well when she was young. She is the woman who made the Guardia Infantes those gigantic hoop skirts. She made them fashionable in the Spanish court. And if you remember, I had a picture of Las Meninas, and then I decided to change the PowerPoint because I wanted to concentrate on this. But she's the one that brings up fashion. So she had a good sense of humor too. That's what my impression is. But she was very, very committed to preserving her son's inheritance intact, and she was staunch Habsburg. So I think because I study mostly the period of the Regency, I see a person consumed, right, by the political aspects. of her rule. But I also have, and this is going to make it into a book. Once she was in exile for 2 years after her tenure in office concluded, and then she went back to Madrid, and she established her own private palace about 300 meters from the royal palace, where she had a full, even as she was dressing as a nun and everything, she had a full royal household. She hosted diplomats from all over Europe. She gave banquets. She had entertainment theater and stuff. So this was a woman that was pretty much a person of the court, right? Even though her image was very austere for obvious reasons. Yeah. Larry.
Two things. You mentioned to me that the Mariana Islands in the Pacific are named for her.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
That blows my mind. But I suppose it's not unheard of given the Philippines.
Right. So yeah, that's another way, and I still don't feel comfortable mentioning this because I feel that I have to do more research. So you're probably going to get another application from me on this topic. But it is very interesting that, and that really, it's an argument for putting her at the very same level as Philip IV, who has the Philippines, and her son, Carlos II, who has the Islas Carolinas also for a while. So, I mean, why would these islands, right, named after her and the colonization of the islands also take place at the very moment that she signs the peace with Portugal? Which is very telling, right? It is at this time that Spain is giving up all these positions in the Indian Ocean, and lo and behold, they try to colonize some more islands in that area. So, but I still don't feel too comfortable about, I mean, I do know they were named after her. I have some information as to the Jesuits that did it on her behalf. I have found some documents at the Newberry Library, and I still have to think about this more. But it's a great point. Yeah.
And the other thing, I think you're too modest when you talk about these scholars getting together to talk about 16th century. I think that by going through these documents, you found things that either no one or very few people are even aware of in European history.
I think, and when I talk to specialists, people that actually are familiar with this, and I just gave 2 presentations in the last couple of weeks. I went to the Association for Spanish and Portuguese Historical Studies, and then I went to the Renaissance Society of America. So, and I was presenting in front of people that are doing this. I mean, they are familiar with these documents, and it was excitement. There was some excitement. So yeah, I'm excited. I want to finish a manuscript and publish it. I am ready to let it out. And yeah. Thank you so much for all your questions. I really appreciate it.
So thanks once again for sharing your expertise
Thank
and
you.
your experiences that you had. So that concludes today's presentations, and we hope to see everyone next year at this event. So thanks to all of you for coming out.